Hi there, welcome to the latest edition of The Front Page. We have a massive Cheltenham Festival talking point and huge industry issues in this week's show. I am Lee Mottershead. I'm joined in the studio by Jonathan Harding and Maddy, Playle, and we kick off with Cheltenham talk, Ascot talk with John Harding.
Yeah, I mean, where else do we start after what was, I think, a fantastic weekend of racing that survived the weather mercifully? And there's only one horse that we need to mention, and really off the bat, and that is Jonbon. Fantastic in the Clarence House and probably going to be fantastic in the Champion Chase as well.
That's the question, isn't it? Is he going to be fantastic in the Champion Chase? Really impressive, I thought, on Saturday. It wasn't quite Shishkin v Energumen Mark II because the horses were ridden in opposite ways. This time, Jonbon was the one out in front, but also he never looked in doubt. It was a completely dominant performance, but the big talking point surely is what happens in the Champion Chase.
Exactly.
Because
all of his career defeats have come at Cheltenham, whether you believe that to just be a coincidence. Of course, one of those occasions was when he faced Constitution Hill in that magnificent Supreme Novices Hurdle. And there was signs of his jumping frailties if we're being very, very picky on Saturday, at the third last, when he got in quite close. But his jumping has appeared to improve, but we've seen it be an issue at Cheltenham before in the Clarence House when he was beaten by Elixir de Nuts and he made that horrific error late on into the piece. I've been studying the Champion Chase division for my Weekender column, which will be out on Wednesday, and one of the key elements to this year's race is that there's so much pace in there. You know, as well as Jonbon, who, as he did on Saturday and as he did in the Schleur earlier this season, made his own running. You have Gaelic Warrior, potentially, Solness, Ile Francais, Matata, who was brilliant at Windsor on Sunday as well. So maybe that could expose some potential flaws in the jumping department. And we know it's a race that throws up shocks. We've had the likes of Politolog, Put the Kettle On, and several others, Special Tiara, create shocks in the race and making all from the front as well. So it's not often a race where everything goes to plan.
No, so we're talking here on Monday morning. He is best price 11 to 8. Jonbon for the Champion Chase with the sponsors. You can get 5 to 4, 11 to 10.
I'm quite surprised he's not odds on, actually.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, I was saying this, I do. There's something about him at Cheltenham which does still concern me. But on the basis of his overall package of form, you know, is it 17 wins from 20?
Yeah.
And he'll be bidding for a 10th Grade 1 at Cheltenham, is that right? He's won his 9th on Saturday. Yeah. Extraordinary horse who probably doesn't get the credit he deserves. It will be his crowning moment. It will be his coming of age almost, even though he's already done. That
was the line that was repeated more than once on Saturday, wasn't it? That he almost has to win a Champion Chase to be regarded as up there with Nicky Henson's other great 2-miler sprinter, Sacra, Altior, Remittance Man, Shishkin. Not all of whom won a Champion Chase, but they're all top 2-mile chases. I still think this Cheltenham issue is fascinating because, as you say, 17 out of 20 elsewhere. So he's never lost anywhere apart from all his other races he's won. The first of those defeats was in the Supreme Novices Hurdle against Constitution Hill, and on that day Pegasus wouldn't have beaten Constitution Hill. He was then probably below par when he was beaten by El Fabiolo in the Arkle, although he ran to exactly the same RPR in his next start when he won the Maghull at Aintree. And then in the Clarence House Chase, things just went horribly wrong with that mistake coming down the hill. I suppose ultimately, John, the question punters have to decide is, do they think Jonbon, period, is a worse horse at Cheltenham than anywhere else? Is he?
To my mind, no. I think, as you've just mentioned there's no shame at all in losing to Constitution Hill, who's a freak of nature, so we can scratch that one off. El Fabiolo, if he's then run to the same RPR somewhere else next time, he might have just been beaten by a better horse at the time. I think Jonbon's improving, incidentally. And then with Elixir de Nuts, that race in the Clarence House, I think that was just too bad to be true, but I'll always forgive a horse one bad run. So if you take it, you sort of follow that logic, I think it's certainly not as big a concern as perhaps people are making it out to be. I think he might just be better than the opposition and have enough in hand to win, even if he is slightly below his absolute peak at Cheltenham.
Do you come to the same conclusion in your column?
He should have too much class, but there's just some nagging doubt. And someone who likes to back horses at big prices, I saw Matata at one point yesterday was 80 to 1. I thought, I'm not backing him at 80 to 1, but that was a bonkers price. I think he's now
50s.
Yeah,
50s
it's
best
still
price.
a big price.
Yeah.
But you know, he's been put in his place in handicaps and that sort of thing. So, but he has taken a big step forward. I will probably find something to take him on with nearer to the time, but I do think that is the story of the race with what we know so far is A, the Jonbon's Cheltenham factor, and B, how will the possibility of lots of pace impact those chances.
Okay. It was a big day for Nicky Henderson. He worked Constitution Hill in the morning, having already declared the horse was set to run at Cheltenham this coming Saturday. All went well on Saturday morning. Lulamba, this big hyped horse Lulamba, who was favourite for the Triumph Hurdle even before he'd run in Britain. I thought he was wildly impressive in that juvenile hurdle at Ascot.
Yeah, and he's beating good horses there, and he was giving weight as well at the same time, I think. So yeah, hugely impressive. It just strikes me that Henderson has always had that quality. He's always had this little conveyor belt of horses that come through, and then like the Serginos, and then the Serginos the next Jonbon, and then Jonbon's the next. You know, he's never lacked for high quality horses, and it strikes me like as though they found another one. It's early days, of course, so there's an awful lot of water to pass under the bridge, but based purely on the eye test of that performance at Ascot, he could be anything.
Do we know who sources the Donnellys, Marie and Joe Donnelly's horses?
Well, so Joe McGrath or Sergino and this
and
lad.
Lulamba. They can't seem to buy a bad one. You know, let's
Was it you
not
that wrote
forget.
that? Somebody wrote that line, yeah.
Yes,
yeah.
it was me. Yeah, I did the setup piece for Lulamba on Saturday, and they just have an exceptional depth of talent to their ranks. You know, they had the dual Gold Cup winner Albin Photo, then they've had Shishkin, then they've had State Man. Just they make horses that make winning Grade 1s and races at the Cheltenham Festival look really, really easy when they're not. So whoever is buying them, I'm sure they have a, you know...
He needs a pay rise.
They have money...
Pay rise for Jerry.
Yeah, pay rise for Jerry.
They have money on their side, but nevertheless, you know, it's a competitive environment. So well done to them for securing another exceptional talent. I was really taken by the way Nicky spoke about this horse afterwards, and I think that's one of my favourite things about speaking to trainers at big race days is you get a real appreciation for their horses, and Nicky was in love with this horse. He said, look at the way he sort of stopped the press and said, look at the way he's you know, his outlook and the way they call it the look of eagles or something.
Okay.
Yeah, and he sort of had a lot of presence and similar mould to Sergino in that he was a big, strong, chasing type. And of course, we could yet see another Seven Barrows star for the Triumph emerge this week.
Yes. Now that was, you talk about things that Nicky says. He said during one of the TV interviews, we've got one more juvenile to come out. He later explained that is Palladium. Palladium, who you remember is the German Derby winner from last year, hasn't yet run over hurdles, was bought by the Bamfords. He's in the Triumph Hurdle, but they also, the owners want him ideally to eventually become a flat stallion. He's still an entire, so he's got a massive residual value still. He's set to run over hurdles at some point in the next week or two, or maybe as late as Kempton, but he's in at Cheltenham on Saturday, so maybe there. My mind started worrying a little bit because I'd said to Nicky about the two horses, and he said, well, I said to him, is there any chance you might split Lulamba and Palladium up at Cheltenham and maybe run one in the Supreme and one in the Triumph? He said, perfectly possible.
Lulamba in a Supreme.
But hang on. I'm on a run here.
Sorry.
Palladium, he said, would definitely go for the Triumph because he's owned by the Bamfords, who sponsor the Triumph Hurdle. Lulamba, I've seen one bookmaker has put Lulamba into the Supreme market today, but he's owned by the Donnellys, who also have Salvatore Mundi in the Supreme, who is the anti-post favourite. So maybe that rolling of the mind was a bit crazy.
I think they've run a couple of horses in the Supreme before. Did Asterion Phalange run in it at the same time one of their other good horses ran in?
And we've also seen that Nicky Henderson is not afraid to run two good novices in the same race,
More than
Constitution Hill and Jonbon. But I did just wonder, I put this in my colour piece on Saturday. I know some people dislike no bet concessions, some people like them, I like them. And I just thought Palladium was a textbook example of one to go with, because he's about 12 to 1 now with those bookies offering that concession. If he wins at Huntingdon this week, or Cheltenham or Kempton on in the Adonis, he will be an awful lot shorter. If he doesn't win, he won't run in the Triumph Hurdle. Because if you've got a horse who you think is going to be potentially a flat stallion, you don't want to see him beaten in 2 jumps races before he then goes back on the flat. Does that make sense, do you think?
Yeah, lots of. I'm just still wondering what price Lulamba was for the Supreme with that one bookmaker.
4 to 1. Non-run, no bet. 8 to 1 without the concession.
That 8 to 1 looks quite tasty because I'm a risk taker.
I get greedy. You'd have to be a big risk taker.
Yeah.
What else do we want to talk about the weekend?
Peter Marsh, very good race.
Yeah.
Very good story.
Did you
Mr.
cry?
Mango. Not quite, no, but I did love that.
It's a lovely story, isn't it?
Yeah, it's one of those that I remember Henry de Bromhead once saying that fairy tales sometimes do happen in racing, but not that often. And this is just an example of a really lovely story of a smaller yard that's suffered, you know, a real loss, and now have this wonderful horse potentially going for the race, the dream-making race, as it were, the Grand National.
Yeah.
Just brilliant. And they only have 6 horses, I believe, now.
Astonishing, isn't it? Yeah.
And one of them is Mr. Vango, who's one of the most likeable horses in training at the moment.
Can any of us envisage Mr. Vango winning a Grand National?
No.
It's harsh.
It makes me sad. An old school Grand National, if you got Red Marauder-like grounds, definitely.
Yeah.
Because he's so brave and he just keeps galloping and jumping, responding for pressure. But these days, we have heard it time and time again about how the handicap's condensed and you need a nigh on a Gold Cup quality horse these days. But that should not stop them trying. And if the ground were to come up in his favour, he'd have a chance for sure. But I'm not sure how likely that is these days. I think with the changes that they've made to the race, it's a classy affair than it used to be.
Okay. Have you got the Grand National winner yet, either of you?
Not yet, working on it.
Okay.
Yeah, same.
Okay, good stuff. And finally, Windsor, Winter Million. Either side of Ascot, the 3 days, 40 quid for the 3-day ticket was tremendous value. The return of jump racing to Windsor. Maddy, you were there on Friday?
Yeah, my first time at Windsor with jumps, and I was very interested to see how the configuration of the track would work. Seemed to go down very, very well, and the main thing that I took away from the day was the feel. We know Windsor Monday nights flat racing has got a wonderful community sort of buzz around it, and it felt like that had been really transferred to the jumps. You know, it's quite a small track to walk around when you're not in front of the stands, and there was a real feel-good feeling about it, I thought, and hopefully that's something that they can build on. I thought the races were very interesting. You know, it wasn't a case of front runners making all, which I wondered whether that could be the case, but nevertheless, we did see some magnificent front-running performances. Gidley Park was brilliant to see him back to his best on Friday, and then Protectorat yesterday was spectacular.
Legend, Protectorat, the legend.
The
Love
legend.
him. Always
Yeah.
loved him.
Copyright.
Very lovable horse.
He's just a. You'd love to own him, wouldn't you? Because he's so willing.
Yeah.
I sense a little bit quirky, which is another plus in the. Yeah, I just think he's fantastic, and I think he'll give anybody a bit of a headache if he does line up in the Rhino.
10 to 1's probably a fair price, isn't it?
He's a reigning champion, isn't
I
he?
could see myself getting involved maybe on the day, because
Okay.
I'm not sure if Factifile does run in the Rhino. I think you could get quite a nice price about Protectorat, but I did think 10 to 1 was a bit big actually.
You know, there are so many imponderables, aren't there, with that race in particular?
Yes, yeah.
Factifile, Banbridge, Ile Francais. There's quite a few horses that we're just not sure.
Well, you know where Protectorat's only going to go one way
Yes.
because he's not entered in the Gold Cup course that he finished 5th and 3rd in, I think.
Yeah.
But I'd give him a better chance in the Gold Cup than Grey Dawning were he to run in it. I think Protectorat's a far better horse than he probably gets credit for.
Okay, much love then for Protectorat. We end part 1 of the programme. We go into a commercial break. When we come back, we'll be talking about craziness, and as we're 3 English people, we'll talk about the weather, but I promise you it won't be boring. Welcome back to the front page. Time now to talk about that craziness thing I referenced, and it relates to the latest in the sorry saga of affordability checks. The craziness involves the former MP Lawrence Robertson, who spoke last week about how in dealing with Bet365, he lost £30 over 3 months, had his account halted, and was asked crazy questions, including whether he was losing sleep at night as a result of his gambling losses. We heard from Ben Gunn, a former BHA board member and a former board member of the Gambling Commission, who won £670 on Saturday with William Hill, and again had his account temporarily halted. Further bad news for British racing as well. In a parliamentary reception on Monday, BHA Chair Jo Smith had in effect pointed out to Baroness Twycross, the gambling minister, that affordability checks weren't working as they were intended to work. He said they have to be frictionless. The minister merely said that checks can be and will be proportionate, and there was also bad news, which we'll come on to, for British racing on the levy reform front. In terms of this affordability checks, the latest on that one, just two more examples with Ben Gunn and with Lawrence Robertson, picking up on what Jo Smith had spoken about, which we discussed on last week's show when he talked about how his Betfair account had been suspended when he told Betfair he's suffering from cancer. And he also spoke about restrictions being increased on his accounts as well. Just further examples of grim stories relating to checks. I suppose, again, the question is, will they make a difference?
Yeah, to me, that is truly bonkers, you know, that someone can spend, what was it, £30 in 3
£30
weeks?
over 3 months.
3 months, rather. And then for me, it's asking the questions like, are you able to sleep at night? And is, you know, trying to figure out if these people are at risk. Well, someone who does have a gambling problem is less likely to answer those questions honestly as well. So I don't think this approach is benefiting the people that it needs to benefit, and particularly when there are cross wires as to what firms are trying to achieve with this. You know, is it security and legitimising your funds and, you know, risk of or, you know, anti-money laundering checks, or is it responsible gambling, affordability checks, and, you know, whether someone is in a healthy state and is spending within their means. And I think there just seems a huge grey area over why these questions are being posed to people, and I don't think it's effective in the way that it needs to be. And not only that, it's clearly impinging on people who do not have problems with how much they're spending, like the people you referenced, Lee. And, you know, once again, we can only say how damaging that is for the sport, because the amount of the sport that is funded by people who enjoy having a bet safely and you know, enjoy it as recreation, as part of, you know, going racing or, you know, going out on a weekend or buying something, is, to me, that there needs to be a clarity of response from the Gambling Commission, and we need to understand more about the trigger points for why and when people are being asked these questions, and how that's actually helping them, in theory, inform the checks that they need to carry out.
Also seems a bit crazy is the fact that we heard again this week that before Christmas, PM Keir Starmer, Chancellor and the Business Secretary had written to 17 regulators asking them to identify areas where they saw that they saw opportunities for growth. We know the government's key mantra is growth, growth, growth. They asked regulators, where can we find growth? There are lots of areas in which within gambling there could be growth potential, but the Gambling Commission wasn't one of those regulators invited in to discussions with the PM and the Treasury. And you got the impression that Andrew Rhodes, the Gambling Commission Chief Executive, in comments that he made last week, that almost he was maybe a little bit surprised, potentially, that they weren't called in, because he also said that there might be areas for growth, but some government policies are already going to impact on growth negatively.
Yeah, I think you can get caught up in the long grass of details and what is frictionless and interim checks and all the rest of it, but that particular element of this story speaks to, I think, just the perception of gambling in government and just perhaps even in society now. I don't think you wouldn't necessarily be looking at the gambling industry and think, wow, that's a great way for the government to make money. I think they'd be cautious of how that would appear wrongly, to my mind. I think this is I think it's very core. While obviously there's some very well-intentioned people who want to support safer gambling, I think this is mainly a case of optics, this whole thing. And it raises the question for me, as we've discussed so many times, why now would you bet on racing? Because if you win too much money, there's the risk of restrictions. If you lose even a small amount of money, there's the risk of being asked for personal information, because we're in this frankly ludicrous halfway house where we kind of have checks but don't, and no one really knows what the lay of the land is. If you're a punter, if you're a bookmaker, dare I say even the Gambling Commission, it's just this weird regulatory kind of abyss that we're in at the moment. There needs to be very quickly absolute clarity and some sort of, if we're going to continue down this path and you're going to persevere with affordability checks, it has to be black and white, and it needs everybody who enters into that agreement when they place a bet or they receive a bet needs to know exactly where they stand and exactly what needs to be asked. And ultimately, that is going to benefit the very people that the legislation is supposed to be aimed at, which is people who may have an issue.
And I think that's the point I was trying to make, Lee, is ultimately this is an environment where there's just a total lack of clarity. You know, whether it be the questions that punters are being asked, or the access or the information that firms and the Gambling Commission are trying to obtain, it doesn't make sense. And it doesn't seem like the current state of play will be effective in achieving any of the objectives it's sought to address.
It's just like Groundhog Day. Every day there's a news story about someone who's been asked over some ridiculous amount of money that they've lost, and they've been asked for something that is not remotely reasonable, and again and again and again. But reputationally, it's almost death by a thousand cuts for racing, because there is only so long people will put up with this level of treatment. So it has to be sorted quickly, because ultimately it's the punters that suffer.
If the punters suffer, then so does the whole sport, of course.
Absolutely.
And the Treasury.
The stakes don't get bigger than this.
Absolutely. Everyone loses. You two both spoke about clarity. One area where there was some unwanted clarity within this parliamentary reception was in relation to levy reform. We've spoken about this plenty on the show before. Just prior to last year's general election, Racing thought it had agreed a deal with bookmakers and the government on levy reform. Bookmakers disputed that. At the reception, Joe Smith basically said that we did say to the minister in his speech, racing and betting have been unable to agree a deal. We need you to come in and sort out levy reform. To which Baroness Twycross said, in a nutshell, no. The quickest way to get more funding into racing is for bookmakers and racing to agree. At the heart of it, seemed to me, was it highlights that racing is going to struggle potentially, probably, to make much headway with the current gambling minister. I didn't think she seemed particularly energised with the brief. She certainly didn't seem minded to do anything on levy reform, and it just leaves racing with a difficult job of how to make progress on that. We saw with the previous administration, racing went right to the top, right to Downing Street in terms of making overtures that did result eventually in an offer on the table from bookmakers and the offer of 10 million quid windfall payment from the Treasury. Well, they're not going to get that again, but it does feel as though they might have to start climbing the ladder to make much headway, and they haven't necessarily got as many friends in the current government as had in the last government.
No, I think that's a fair summation of that. I don't think anybody in racing believes it is a fix-all levy reform. but it is quite rightly viewed as quite an important counterbalance to the damage that's being caused over here with the gambling review and everything else. The two issues have become quite closely linked, rightly or wrongly. It does feel to me like after coming that close, that it did feel like a unique moment in time, that levy, those conversations about the levy between racing and bookmakers. It felt very important that that got over the line. It didn't, for various reasons, some out of racing's control, of course. But yeah, it does feel a lot like starting again now. As for friends in government, you've got to go and make those friends. There is clearly work taking place on that front, and I don't think racing is as detached from the Labour Party as perhaps some people think. I think there is a lot of love for the sport in there, but racing has to put forward its case and get down to numbers and be quite pragmatic, which I'm sure it will be.
Yeah, the reception was actually hosted by the All-Party Parliamentary Group, who's co-chaired by Dan Carden, Labour MP, who actually gave an address. So there definitely are links between Labour and racing, just maybe not as strong as we would like them to be. One other connection,
I was just going to say, Lee, before you go into that, it's interesting, isn't it? These challenges are coming at a time when so many key figures within British racing are on their way out, already gone. And I think that doesn't paint a picture of confidence either. You want people who are familiar with these issues and familiar with their post and what it involves, and to be able to respond, and we don't even have that luxury at the moment.
No. But we do have the weather, and the weather.
We'll always have the weather.
We'll always have the weather, and the weather has been causing problems, Maddy. 'Twas ever thus.
Yes, Thursday at Ludlow. The meeting was cancelled actually after racing was supposed to start. This happened because the course passed a 7 a.m. inspection. Officials were happy with conditions, but they wanted to give an extra 35 minutes to allow the ground chance to thaw. However, some of the jockeys then displayed that they weren't happy with the state of the track, and the meeting was therefore abandoned. The first race was initially supposed to be at 12:40. As I say, it was then pushed back, and they had that 35 minutes before the ultimate decision was made. And this is just a continuation of a theme. We've had dreadful weather in Britain and Ireland so far in 2025. Musselburgh, there was a big case there a couple of weeks ago. They were abandoned just 6 minutes before the first scheduled race after a host of inspections, one at 8 and one at 10:15, with the track raceable the day before, and officials at the track obviously wanted to give it the best chance. On the same day as Ludlow, we had Newcastle. There was a 30-minute delay to racing there due to an area of concern at the end of the back straight. So at the start of the back straight,
rather. But they raced.
But they did race. So this has been the subject of much anger and outrage on social media, as ever thus. But it's a eternally tricky situation, and one that David Jennings has addressed in his column.
The number of which is?
Sorry?
The number of which is in DJ's column?
Essentially that it's infuriating but not unacceptable that we have these last-minute cancellations, and I think DJ spoke a lot of sense in that racing is very much unique and stands alone when it has to deal with weather in this way. Other sports, DJ referenced in his column the amount of times he's been to a football match and they've been warming up and then they've been forced to cancel. So other sports do deal with the weather, but not quite in the same way as racing, because we're dealing with, animals and jockeys and safety, perhaps more so than other sports. And I've got to admit, when I study these scenarios and I see racing and a whole card abandoned, either marginally before or after the first race is due to begin, I feel a lot for connections, because in this day and age with costs rising, petrol costs rising, etc., it's going to take a long time for a lot of these people to reach courses, particularly if they're not local to them, and it's a big commitment to travel. And it does seem to me ludicrous that such a decision can be on a knife edge that late on in the day. However, is probably what is just needed in this
Well,
environment.
that's it, isn't it? Yeah.
Because if you create a scenario where racecourses have to have made a decision by 10 a.m, you would then end up with a lot less meetings and, of course, losing valuable fixtures than if people gave it much longer. You know, particularly when you're talking about the weather at the moment, it's down to how much the temperatures will rise in the morning to negate the effects of the frost. And no matter how many forecasts you read, that's not always reliable.
No.
And conditions are ultimately always changeable. So I went from sort of being angry and thinking it was not on to reading DJ's piece, and it actually swayed my mind a little bit, because what are you going to do? I think there's a couple of things. I'll let you two both have your say first, but I think there's a couple of things that could be done to maybe streamline the process.
Okay, well, ultimately, it seems to me there are two questions to ask with situations like Ludlow and Musselburgh and others. One is, has anyone done anything wrong? You know, has someone, one or more people, one or more organisation erred? And could we do it in a different way? Now, with the Ludlow one, what's particularly interesting is that Ludlow, Simon Shield, the clerk of the course there, has said he believed they could and should have raced. So the race course thought that track was fine to race. The participants, who ultimately, particularly the jockeys who have to actually go out on the track and ride the horses, said no, we didn't think it was right to race. So you will sometimes have
Simon, of course, a previous jockey himself.
Yeah, won the Gold Cup on Desert, and a previous trainer as well.
Yeah.
Trainers are clearly frustrated on this one, massively frustrated, not least because they probably get it most in the neck from owners who they're having to invoice for transport costs that shouldn't have been made in the first place. And trainers generally can be pretty hostile and suspicious of racecourses. They're probably taking the view that the racecourse doesn't want to lose out on attendances, on hospitality payments, and crucially on media rights. So racecourses want the income they will get from a race meeting, and I think trainers are probably suspicious of racecourses going beyond the point at which there is a realistic chance of racing, just in the hope of getting a fixture on. But I thought Peter Rowe was interesting, manager of Fairyhouse in DJ's column. He said, well, look, we have our reputations to think of, and we don't want to annoy people by abandoning late in the day when it was obvious we couldn't have raced.
And they also, a lot of racecourses will offer concessions when, you know, a meeting has been abandoned, and they will either offer, if you're the public, they'll offer you a free reciprocal ticket or money back and a full refund, or you know, I know there have definitely been cases in the past where they've offered compensation to connections for horses as well.
Right. And it's
so
also,
that's another check coming out of their
And it's
pocket.
also true that trainers can withdraw horses once an inspection has been called, and not face a fine. In fact, they can make their own choice about whether to run or not.
But it's a judgment call.
It's a judgment call, and ultimately, I suppose that's always going to be the case, isn't it? Because that second question, is there anything we can do about it? You either say we are going to have a rule whereby if you're going to abandon, or you have to make a call by 10 a.m. or 9 a.m. or 11 a.m. or something like that. And as you said, John, if you do that, you are always going to risk losing meetings that otherwise would have been staged, such as the one at Newcastle on the same day as the Ludlow fixture that fell.
It's just straightforward to me. I might be missing something, so you know, feel free to send in your postcards of all the things I'm missing. But
you say scrap racing in the winter.
No, I just think you have option A and option B. Option A is you give a meeting every single chance, which they have to do, which is why I don't think anyone's done anything wrong. They have to. You'd be more annoyed if they didn't give it every single chance and leave it as
have no chance.
No, but there's obviously
a trainer and you're travelling, you know,
there's a tipping
hundreds of
point.
miles up the country to get there and spending all that money. I think a percentage of them would rather know.
Common sense, isn't it? There's a tipping point, of course. Then has to come a point where they go, actually, this is too late in the day. And I think everyone would agree 10 minutes before a race is due to go off, you've probably left that too late. You should have just, you know, drawn stumps before then. But the alternative is, you know, there's a lot of people outraged on social media, but then when you say, well, what actually do you want then as an alternative? If you have option B, which is a really prescriptive, if it's 7:30, you make your call and that's it. And how many meetings would we lose where the weather does change and the ground does thaw, and you'd have a lot of blank Saturdays and blank days full stop if that happens. So I just think it's one of those where the system is probably as good as it can actually be. I think the only areas you might be able to improve is when you know, be a little bit more decisive perhaps, and communicate your decision better, because I think a lot of this stems from the fact that you're getting very close to the first race, no one really knows what's going on, and then they have to make what is clearly a difficult decision.
And if you're making that decision from a trainer's perspective about whether to send the horse there or not, if you felt the communication was excellent and there were regular updates on social media, maybe you could see picture of the race horse, you might be more inclined to.
I think that's it. I think communication is once again a key term in this. With the Ludlow case, I wonder whether, because it was the jockeys and the trainers who had the issue with the ground and not the official ground staff, whether there could, I'm not saying this has to be mandated per se, but whether, jockeys are 9 times out of 10 at the track much earlier than the first race. Can they be consulted on these things perhaps earlier than they would usually be if there is a discrepancy between parties? Would that help, reach a verdict sooner rather than, okay, we've got an inspection at 10:30, let's say. Well, why? If there'll be jockeys in the weighing room before then. Get them to come out and have a look and give their verdict. And also, you've taken the words out of my mouth with communication. If everyone understands. Even if a clerk was to come out and say, this is a knife-edge decision, it will go one of two ways, that clarity is giving trainers the option to go, well, that decision is not worth us travelling all the way up there and paying that money, then that makes it a lot easier. Whereas if, obviously, the clerks want to give it the best possible chance, but I think if the communication was better all the way through, people would feel less hard done by.
Just almost one last point on clerks. Again, Peter Rowe, Ferry House manager, made the point that there's a key difference between Ireland and Britain, in that in Ireland the clerks are employed by the IHRB, the regulator. In Britain, the clerks are employed by the racecourses. Yep. Obviously, it's not just the clerks who make the calls on abandonments, the stewards are involved as well. But he thought that was a factor in terms of confidence of participants, in that they maybe have more confidence in a decision being made purely by, in effect, someone employed by the regulator, not someone who is financially vested in
looking after their own interests. Well, that's another thing to look into then. But the stewards, as you say, they're represented whenever there is concerns. Could that be something that's looked into, whether there's more of an official line, so to speak, from the BHA on what is acceptable and what is not, rather than the racecourse themselves? Yeah,
tough stuff. We'll hope not to talk about the weather next week, but we might. Time to wrap up the programme. Loads of interesting stories this week, but I am in a positive mood, so we'll give it to a racing story. We'll give it to Jonbon. Jonbon's a wonderful horse. Jonbon, your story's about Jonbon, wasn't it, basically?
Pretty much, yeah.
Jonbon. Jonbon wins. Will he win the champion chase? That's the big question. We'll discuss that, no doubt, in later shows between now and the Cheltenham Festival. We will be back next week. Thank you to John. Thank you to Maddy. Thank you to watching. Do come back next week. It'll be marvellous. Until then, goodbye.